Next up with the Synergetic Press, we have the Zach Leary introducing his new book. And I'm really excited and honored to have him on our stage, please.
Hi, guys. How's everybody doing? Thanks for coming. Those of you who are here, those of you who are on the outskirts. Exactly. Woo! We're nearing the end of our time together at Psychedelic Science. Well, some of us. I know some of us will go longer than others. I'm a little bit crispy today. You know, I went to Meow Wolf last night, which is kind of the living embodiment of our culture in so many ways, right? And I think largely that is what my book is about, Your Extraordinary Mind, Psychedelics in the 21st Century and How to Use Them. How we take each and every one of these experiences and integrate them into our life and manifest something amazing, whether that is inside of us, whether that is outside of us. And something like Meow Wolf is an extraordinary manifestation of psychedelic consciousness, and such a joy to be there. You know, my book, when I set out to write my book, of course, you know, I think the low-hanging fruit kind of methodology for writing my book was really legacy-oriented. And that is something I am, of course, very proud of. You know, the association with my father's legacy is a great thing, and being taught and mentored and really embraced by Ram Dass and having spent so much time with him over the years is an extraordinary thing. But as I was sort of forming the book, what really hit me was that I didn't really feel it was the most authentic representation of my truest self to just write stories about Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. You know, those are things that you could find out there. Those are things I can tell you about off on the side, but that's not something I just wanted to write a book about. I thought they certainly would be much more proud of me to write a book that was an expression of my own voice, my own opinions, my own experiences, my own extraordinarily, wildly successful tales, my own falls from grace, my own rising from the ashes, and my own, observations of having worked with so many people in the psychedelic space, and kind of showing how they inspired me rather than just talking about them. So that's really how the book came to be, I think, first and foremost. And what I tried to do throughout the book was really keep an autobiographical lens throughout every tale and every chapter, every subject, every experience that I shared with you guys, the reader. I didn't try. So it's kind of like there is a lot of first-person kind of narratives. I didn't try to write about anything that I personally was not intimately familiar with myself from an experiential level, and I thought that was an important distinction. When I was growing up doing psychedelics and being exposed to the psychedelic world, of course, through my family lineage and the way that I grew up, but my entryway into the psychedelic community was through the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead was my family, my first introduction to psychedelic use, my first community, my first church. And being immersed in the Grateful Dead experience gave me such this amazing kind of almost like this psychic, spiritual safety net to explore my own inner consciousness with, right? And when you do that at a young age, I want to say that first and foremost, you really need that, Had I not had that, I think using so many high-dose LSD trips probably would have ended very differently. But when you have a safety net like that built in, filled with so much love, compassion, empathy, and filled with people who really understand what it's like to traverse those layers of consciousness and to pierce through the veils of reality in that way, you end up a better person for it. But at an early age, when I was using psychedelics, we weren't really, this was the late 80s, and we weren't really aware, especially in that time, psychedelic research was dormant. I want to keep in mind, Yes, MAPS was a brand new little organization, but it was a 3-person nonprofit kind of fledgling out of Santa Cruz, California, operating out of $50 donations. Psychedelic research was pretty much dormant, null and void. And so we were using psychedelics really just to get closer with God and to explore consciousness and to pierce those veils of reality and to see the world through the other side and to really question this kind of common thing, this construct that we call reality, right? But when you're so young, you don't really have that much life under your belt. Most of my early psychedelic experiences were really externally focused. They weren't internally focused. I didn't know what it meant to heal. I didn't know what trauma was. I didn't know about any of that. I was just, trying to get in touch with the entities and kind of get a message from them and kind of see how that could affect my life. So, what that did for me, it certainly planted seeds of, deep spiritual reverence, deep reverence for the mystical path. And those two things specifically, I think, really even shape my position and my point of view on psychedelics today. And as we fast forward all of these years later and we see this amazing revolution in treating mental health, in healing our traumas and various other disorders of the human predicament, it's still my belief that no matter what it is that you're coming into psychedelics for, whether that is for trauma, depression, addiction, anxiety, et cetera, fill in the blank, I think the solution is still mystical, is still spiritual in nature. I still think the reparative process that comes from the psychedelic experience really nurtures that spiritual hole in our heart that creates these maladies in the first place, if that makes any sense. With trauma, it can be a little bit different because trauma does, for most of us, myself included, trauma does have some external components that could have caused the trauma in the first place. But still, nonetheless, even with traumatic experiences, I think they slowly chip away at our connection, at our ability to connect with ourselves, with our own hearts, with our own inner intelligence. It certainly takes us away from our own inner healer mechanism and takes us away from spirit, because those wounds rise up to the front of our waking state of consciousness and really operate our everyday waking life, right? And I think psychedelics are such an amazing tool to kind of get us to step back a little bit from our ego, from our perceptions of what being in our waking state of consciousness really is. And that can sometimes be a very limiting belief system, And I think psychedelics really challenging our self-limiting belief systems and really open us up to new possibilities, new pathways for healing. And so in every chapter in my book, I think that is encapsulated. There's a chapter on trauma, there's a chapter on addiction, there's a chapter on death and dying, there's a chapter on set and setting, and I think most importantly, there is a chapter on integration, which is kind of the last thing I'm going to really talk about here. I thought it was when I was writing my book and doing the research for it, one thing that I noticed, and I went back and I revisited a lot of the classic 60s kind of iconic, original books on the psychedelic experience, not a single one of them mentions integration. And it's a really kind of interesting, kind of almost conspicuously absent component of the psychedelic experience. They don't talk about integration. Even my dad's book, The Psychedelic Experience, it just was not really on the radar. And if you think about that and you look back on maybe some of the problems that happened with 1960s psychedelic use, I think integration might be at the top of the list. So many people went so high, so fast, that they didn't really have the tools to know what to do with it afterwards. Certainly some people did, and our culture is better for it, but on an interpersonal level, I didn't think so. So, I'm a facilitator, and I've worked with hundreds of people in one-on-one settings and in retreat settings as well, but mostly one-on-one. And the integration process, and I know that's the theme of the Psychedelic Science Conference, the integration, right? We all talk about that's where the work happens, that's where the work begins, and all of that. And I certainly think that's true to a point. I really do. But what I was noticing was that, number one, a lot of people who come into the space have a tendency to want to chase peak experience. That if you go back in just one more time, that you're going to get the answers, and you can keep kind of chasing that need to connect with that other world kind of sense of divinity and entity-based intelligence. And there's certainly some value in that for sure, but chasing peak experience is one. And second, I really kind of noticed that with the people I was working with, and also with my own self-experimentation, that integration in the simplest form is about turning insight into action. And what that action might mean to you and to me can be different for each and every one of us. So when writing the book, I couldn't quite figure out how to distill that into a singular concept. And I was talking about it with my partner one day and kind of just riffing on my philosophical, tendencies around this, around making each and every experience long-lasting and really getting the people that I work with to, extract every kind of nugget of wisdom from each and every session. And she said to me, sustainability. And so that is kind of the core philosophical component of my book, setting, and sustainability. So I'm kind of adding the third S to set and setting. And I'm kind of proud to say, it's kind of been a hard thing to wrestle with as terms of my ego goes and things like that. But if there's anyone alive who could add to the set and setting paradigm, I think it's me, I think my dad wrote it, so if there's anyone who could, and my mentor co-wrote it, so I kind of have taken a lot of poetic license and liberty and asking for their permission in spirit and meditation in the psychedelic space. Is it okay if I add a set and setting? And that's what I'm doing. So set, setting, and sustainability. And yeah, thank you. And again, sustainability is really about coming together as a community and also as individuals and kind of making that cosmic contract with our psychedelic friends that we can maximize each and every single experience, right? And not only maximize each and every single experience, but we can take that and have it influence our lives and our communities and our relationships and our families and our work environments and our art and our music in profound new ways. And that is, to me, that feels kind of like an important distinction because, we look around so much in the modern psychedelic movement and there's so much talk about healing, psychedelic healing. And I have healed so much in the psychedelic space. Of course I have. But I think there's another level to healing. It's okay, once we've kind of healed ourselves and feel like we're on the right path and hey, we've kind of gotten our light back, how can we reach out and make the world a better place, right? And tying it back to the 60s, that was really, I think, the single best thing that the 60s got right with psychedelics, is they were really intent. That original counterculture mantra was so intent around making the world a better place. Civil rights, climate change, the sexual revolution, women's rights, music, film, art, the clothes we wear. And if we kind of take that for granted today, we look around and see all the amazing visionary art over there and all of these kind of different things. And Meow Wolf, like I was talking about today, these are all great little remnants from the 1960s. But, Yeah, so if you apply set setting and sustainability, I think that's a possibility for each and every one of us to self-actualize in this lifetime, not the next lifetime, and make the most out of your experiences. So, yeah, my book's been out for a couple months. I hope you pick it up. There's also an audiobook, which I also read myself, which I'm really, really proud of. Yeah, if you want to get it signed, I'll be over there. The bookshop's going to close in an hour or so. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for having me, guys.
Do you have time for a few questions?
Yeah, if there are any.
Okay, yeah.
Hi. Oh,
Hey.
Wow, that was loud. So you had touched on the fact that you had spent a lot of time in your life with Ram Dass. I spent a good chunk of the time yesterday and the day before hearing some tales from people as well. In the context of the conversation that you were saying that integration wasn't really a part of the conversation, but now it very much is like a central kind of core concept. I feel that Ram Dass touched on a lot of these concepts and maybe unintentionally had been talking about it. I guess I'm wondering on your personal thoughts on where the evolution of this conversation of integration came from seeing where it was more of an esoteric spiritual concept to now being a little bit more of an action step.
No, and thanks for asking that question. And also in my book, I use the Ram Dass case study. I think it's probably one of the most profound case studies on integration. Before Ram Dass became Ram Dass, when he was still Richard Alpert, he was living in the gatehouse at Millbrook in the winter of 66 going into 67, living in the gatehouse at Millbrook, doing LSD every single weekend for a period of about 4 months. And this is 6 years into the psychedelic experience with Timothy. And then he finally called Timothy up in early 67 and said, Timothy, we failed. You have to come down. This is not a sustainable method, right? Then he went to India and he met a man who didn't come down, Neem Karoli Baba, and he was gifted a new map of consciousness, right? And discovered the practice of bhakti yoga and spirituality and always connecting to our divinity and staying in that place. But what's really interesting about that story is, and this is often grossly mistaken in the story of Ram Dass, he did not stop doing psychedelics. He just instead didn't look at it as this process of coming up and down. But if you integrate other practices in your waking state of consciousness, it augments the psychedelic experience and makes the psychedelic experience just another thing that you do. It doesn't have to be the thing. It's just another thing that you do. And if you do yoga or meditation or breath work or tantra or float tanks or IFS or whatever it is, these are very important, I think almost mandatory subsequent additions that you need to make the psychedelic experience, to integrate it. If you don't have tools at your disposal, how are you going to integrate it, right? And I'm a big proponent of there's no one set methodology for integration. I think it's a multitude of things. But to the last part of your question, I think it's really just within the last decade or so have we kind of started to coin the term and moved it into a 3-step process: preparation, the journey, and integration. But I think Ram Dass played a pivotal part in that, no question. Yeah. And I also want to say one thing too. I know there's not too many of you here, but I teach an online course. It starts again July 2nd, and my co-friend and assistant Jennings has information on that over there. But I'll be signing books in the back, and yeah, thanks guys.